name is Eileen Burbage, and I'm the Executive Director here at Fertifa. It's a real pleasure to talk about neurodiversity today and how this feeds into benefits and a lot of what we've been doing at Fertifa for so many years. I'm joined by Holly, and before we introduce ourselves and get going with the content, I just wanted to establish a couple of housekeeping points. So as I mentioned, it is still summer holidays for some. As a result, but also because we do this anyway for all of our webinars, we are recording this session, and that is for those who haven't been able to join us today live and might want to watch it back after they're back at work, but also for any of you who are with us today and might want to go back and rewatch or pick up on anything that we might have mentioned. Having said that, and because it's being recorded, a couple of other points, we do have the chat function enabled where all of you are able and welcome to, please, you're invited to chat with Holly and myself as we go. Trust me, Holly would much rather hear from many of you other than me. She hears from me probably enough day in and day out, but it'll also make sure that we keep the conversation relevant to what you'd all like to hear about and for the reasons that you all joined today. Similarly, we also have the Q&A function that's enabled as well. You do have the option to ask your questions anonymously. I will probably try as much as I can to answer those as we go. So again, please don't feel the need to hold off on questions or comments or anything in the chat. We're really, really keen to make sure that what we talk about is of interest to all of you and actually hits the mark in terms of what you were hoping to hear by joining us today. And so we've got both the chat and the Q&A. Both can be anonymous, and we do hope that you'll bear in mind that if you choose not to be anonymous when you ask anything in the Q&A, that you'll remember that this is being recorded, so it will be sort of saved in posterity. So having said those housekeeping points, Holly, do you mind introducing yourself real quick, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's an absolute privilege to be here today to discuss what I think is such an important topic. As Eileen said, my name's Holly Rowland. I'm Head of Clinical Services here at Fertifa. My work is always centered around supporting individuals at various life stages, and I've seen sort of firsthand just how a supportive and sort of understanding environment can make all the difference to people and individuals. And it's given me sort of an appreciation for the unique needs of every person, which is why I'm here today, and a passionate advocate for creating inclusive environments where everyone can thrive. And I think as well, it's worth me mentioning that I've sort of managed a team for quite a few years now, and that in itself has given me sort of a good perspective and understanding of sort of reasonable adjustments and accommodations for neurodivergent individuals as well. So hopefully I can share some useful information with everyone today.
Thank you, Holly. And as usual, Holly's being a bit modest. She did mention she does oversee the entire clinical services team. So for those of you who might be existing Fertifa clients or those who would be considering how the benefit might work for your employees, it is Holly's team and her oversight of that team that really is the product or the offering in terms of what value your employees could get and the one-to-one support they would get from her and her team. Similarly, Holly's also the one who oversees the partnerships that we have. And I think we'll get on to the fact that at Fertifa, we're really proud of the providers we work with who are specialist neurodiversity partners and how they might support employees. But again, Holly being too modest, so I wanted to give her a shout out for all the work that she does in these areas. Real quick intro on me. I've already mentioned I'm the executive director here for Fertifa. That just means that I get to take the credit most of the time for all of the work that Holly and her colleagues all do in terms of providing employees with best-in-class clinical support and advice for a number of topics. And I'll just then touch on that a bit because some of you might be wondering why a company named Fertifa is doing a webinar on neurodiversity support. It is true that as a company, and those that might know us for a while might know that when we set up as many as 6 years ago, we started with fertility and family forming support. And over the years, we have broadened our provision and the benefits that we provide to cover all of reproductive, hormonal, and sexual health. Doing that, of course, is in response to what our clients and what our patients have requested, but it's also as part of our mission to try and be as inclusive as absolutely possible for these sensitive topics. In part of supporting our clients to be inclusive workplaces, neurodiversity has just come up more and more over the last few years. And in fact, it is in response to clients' specific requests about whether or not what we do for reproductive and hormonal and sexual health could be then applied to neurodiversity in terms of the wellbeing support that we're here to provide to individuals and employees at workplaces, and then also navigational support in order to get maybe specialist advice, specialist assessments, maybe screening or workplace needs assessments, for example, as it relates to this topic. And of course, there's massive intersectionality between neurodiversity, those who identify as neurodivergent, and what they might seek in terms of well-being support for their health. So that's how we find ourselves here today. I'm really, really pleased to say that talking about neurodiversity is one of the things that we speak the most about with some of our prospective and existing clients now, both on the sort of sales side, but also the post-sales support and in terms of what we're providing to employees. We're really pleased that more and more workplaces are asking about it and also looking at not only the well-being support, the education and awareness, but also even in some cases, reimbursement and paying towards some of employees' treatment costs or assessment costs as they look at helping them with their neurodiversity needs. So with that said, I've rambled on enough and I'm going to turn the mic back over to Holly because I think it might be worth starting on some definitions and language. Do you mind taking us through what we mean when we talk about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and then even neurotypical as terms, please, Holly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the world of neurodiversity can be a bit confusing with lots of terms that are often used interchangeably and sometimes used incorrectly as well. So yeah, as I said, it's good to clear up some of the most sort of common ones. So first of all is we have neurodiversity. So this is sort of the starting point and the title of our event. It's simply the understanding that human brains are different and there's a natural biological variation in how they function. Think of it a bit like, just diversity, take away the neuro section. We are all different and not expected to be the same. Our brains are similar. So the key here is that neurodiversity includes every single one of us. We are all neurodiverse, which then sort of nicely leads on to like the term neurodivergence or neurodivergent. This is a word that often gets confused with the first one. So while we are all neurodiverse as a collective, we are not all neurodivergent. Neurodivergence means having a brain that processes information differently or diverges from what is considered sort of typical. It's incredibly important that we view this as a difference in brain function and not a deficit. And then finally, we have neurotypical. And this term refers to an individual whose brain function falls within what society considers the norm. And this is an important distinction because our world, from social expectations to our workplaces, is built with the neurotypical brain in mind.
Super. Thank you. And then did you want to say something about language as well, which I know some people are thinking, well, you've just covered some language points, but other points aside from these specific terms?
Yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning about when we talk about individuals, you might hear two different ways of speaking. So there's person first language. So you might use that to say a person with autism, and identity first language. So an autistic person, for example. The person first language emphasizes the person over their diagnosis, and the core belief is that the person is more important than their disability, and the condition is something that they have, not who they are. Identity first language places the descriptor first and is favoured by many in the community, and acknowledges that neurodivergence is a core part of their identity and a way of affirming their identity and challenging their idea that their condition is something to be cured or overcome. So best practice is always just to respect an individual's preference, as both are used and valued within the community. And if you're unsure, it's just a good idea to listen to the language that a person uses to describe themselves and just follow their lead. So when speaking generally or sort of thinking about policies or how you communicate within your companies, it's just worth acknowledging both perspectives and showing that, and that's a way of showing that you're informed and respectful of the sort of diversity within that community.
Super. Thank you for clarifying that. And I think I have a feeling this will be a common thread throughout our entire conversation, which is not even in doubt, but whenever there's any uncertainty, or the best thing to do always is to ask. And that applies to almost everything we're going to talk about today. But before we go into some of the topics and what we wanted to cover, having established these definitions and some of the advice or suggestions we have about language, I wanted to actually ask those that are watching us and have joined us today a few questions, if that's all right, in a poll. And it's mostly about what's already in place at their organization. So I just started a poll. It has 3 questions. We are asking whether or not people have already some form of workplace neurodiversity support at their company. If they do, what types of examples those are. And we've offered, just some of them. Not necessarily, it's not an exhaustive list, but we're looking forward to seeing what people might have already in place. And then, of course, asking whether or not then those that are on the webinar are actually prioritizing potentially introducing either additional or at all some workplace support for neurodiversity within the next year. And so I'll just leave that open for a couple of minutes, looking at sort of once we get the majority of those that are on the webinar, once they've had a chance to participate and to answer these 3 questions. But I think that'll be really helpful because it will set the context for us, or at least a level of expectation for Holly and myself to understand, who's with us today. Also might have me encouraging you all then to chime in and to give us your opinions even more so, depending on what the responses are. But I do think it's a good place or a good way for us to set the scene. So we do have the majority of you having already answered, but I can see more people are still taking the time to answer. So thanks very much for that. Just leave it going for another 10 seconds or so. Just might be able to get 100% participation, which would be amazing. But I'm seeing that the trend is that most people already have some form of neurodiversity support, and I will share the results of this poll, but I said I'd leave it open for 10 more seconds, so I'm letting that time out. And then of that, there's a smattering. It does seem like there's 20% who say they're offering none of what we included, which actually overlaps the fact that 27% said that they don't have anything in place today. So that's good. There's consistency there. Again, I still see people answering, which is why I haven't ended the poll. But I think I might cut it off there. So otherwise it's unfair that I'm reading some of these responses without being able to show you all what I'm looking at. So I'm still seeing people answer, but I'm going to end the poll now and I'll share the results. So the majority, almost 75%, so almost 3 out of 4 of you say that there is some form of neurodiversity support already in your workplace. Of those that responded, whether yes or no, and none of the above was an option here, and that is 18% said none of the above. But of the rest, the most responded, or the most noted thing, was flexible working. And then there are other points such as access to educational materials, which 1/3 of you say is available. More than 1/4 of you say that there are there's employee resource groups or potentially neurodiversity champions. More than 10%, so 13% said that there's a policy in place. And then even more than 10% said that there's some form of funding that's already in place as well for either diagnostics, workplace needs assessments, and the like. Another 20%, that could be overlap, mentioned that there's financial support for counseling or therapy as well. So thank you all for taking the time to answer that. And nearly 60%, 59% say that additional support is a priority for 2026. So that's super. I think that it makes sense. It's consistent to probably why we hoped people would join the webinar, but we do appreciate people sharing their thoughts on that and what they already have in place. I think it's good sort of a segue then to move into some of the topics we're going to discuss, which is, having established the definition of these terms, a point about language is to talk about some of the traits relating to neurodiversity. So some of the things that we're talking about. And I'll just say before I turn it back over to you, Holly, we're not going to spend time going into specific, some of the specific examples of when people identify as being neurodivergent, whether that's autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and the like. We're not going to go into specific points that people might cover. What we want to talk about is traits. What we want to talk about is the breadth of what makes this such an important point about diversity, and why people will think about themselves as neurodiverse, and therefore what workplaces can do to support some of the different examples. But let's go to then some of the traits, if that's all right.
Yeah, so what we have here is just like a very small selection of traits, and this list could go on and on for days. So we just sort of like highlighted sort of like some of the most common ones that we find. And, again, I've said it before in this session so far, and that it's important to remember that these aren't deficits. They're part of how a person's brain is wired. And in the right environment, these traits can be like really incredible strengths. But in sort of more typical workplaces, that maybe isn't built to accommodate people that have these traits, it can become real challenges. It can lead to things like lower engagement, reduced productivity, increased turnover, as well as poor mental health outcomes as well. So just to kind of pick on the first one, then, so hyperfocus. So this is the ability to maintain that deep focus, that intense concentration on a task. It's obviously fantastic for productivity and getting a complex task done. But someone with this trait might be able to complete a huge project with incredible efficiency. The sort of flip side of that, though, is that someone with hyperfocus might lose track of time. They might forget to take a lunch break. They might sort of miss some of their other responsibilities. They might miss an email just because they are so absorbed in their work. Attention to detail. So many neurodivergent people have a keen eye for detail. This is, again, obviously a huge strength in roles that require high accuracy, like quality control or editing. They can spot errors that others might miss entirely. And again, the sort of flip side of that is that this can sometimes lead to that sort of perfectionism, which might slow down the pace of work because they're so focused on getting every single detail exactly right. Sensitivity to stimuli can often be quite a tricky one. So some neurodivergent individuals are highly sensitive to their environment. So noises, lights, smells, textures. If you're thinking about the aircon wars that happen sort of during in the winter and the summer, how that can sort of disrupt someone's day. Again, this can be a strength because it makes them perceptive to those sort of subtle changes, but it can also be a challenge. Is like busy, noisy, the open plan office spaces can often be quite overwhelming and make it difficult to focus or even think. So sort of, we'll talk about this a bit later, but sort of things like the flexible working, which is becoming more and more common now, can make quite a big difference to someone that has challenges like that. I've not gone through the whole list there, Eileen. I hope that's okay, but just to give a good example of a couple where and demonstrate the strengths and the challenges that come with those traits.
No, of course. Thank you so much for highlighting some of these. And I just wanted to mention, while thanking somebody who actually made a note in the Q&A as an example to sensitivity to stimuli, thank you for reminding me because I'm terrible at this. I should have acknowledged or understood that clearly some individuals would probably want to answer the poll in silence or have the opportunity to focus on that. And my talking, while some people were still responding to the poll, is obviously not super supportive nor conducive to individuals being able to concentrate and focus on those. So I think that's a very real-time example of the sensitivity to stimuli and how, individuals like myself, managers, but workplaces, when we think about working with neurodiverse individuals and diverse people of all traits, that we should think about how people best work and best thrive, and therefore can contribute the most or be more productive in what they do. And this is why these topics are so important. So thank you for mentioning all of those. And I do think it's probably then worth going into, whilst considering these traits, and I love that you've pointed out that these are not necessarily all challenges, that there are strengths. A lot of this can become sort of superpowers for an individual, and that it's just about how we harness, how we try to make the most of an individual's, the diversity and how they focus and how they do their work in order to get the best for an organization or for a team. But I think we should move on then to some of the things that can be done in a workplace to adjust, accommodate, and amplify or enhance, as we've said on this slide, what productivity and well-being can be for individuals that identify as neurodivergent. Do you mind taking us through some of the things that you've seen to be most effective, or some of the things that we recommend as a clinical team to patients that might book in and speak to you about support?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very much not a one-size-fits-all approach. And a neurodivergent person's needs are as unique as they are. So that's why it's really important to sort of continue those open, ongoing conversations sort of through that employees' time at work. The goal is to work with the individual and find solutions that work best for them, rather than sort of assuming, making assumptions about what would be the best outcome for them. So with that in mind, some of the common adjustments that we've seen to make quite a big difference are sort of creating those sort of sensory friendly spaces. So providing quiet zones or low stimulation areas where an employee can take a break or work away from sort of like the hustle and bustle of a busy office. And it's also helpful to sort of be able to offer things like flexibility with things like lighting, temperature, noise levels. Many neurodivergent individuals benefit from communication that's sort of direct and explicit. So sometimes like the office banter, like sarcasm or indirect requests, or even just verbal requests in meetings can often be much better received in like a written summary, which is obviously getting better now with the AI summaries that we have from our Teams meetings and things like that, or even sort of visual aids or just to clarify those tasks. Providing sort of meeting outlines and agendas in advance can also help everyone prepare and sort of focus. Sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge not knowing what's coming. So sort of being able to prepare ahead of time can be really helpful. We've touched on it lightly already, flexible working arrangements. So obviously I think post-COVID, I know we're still talking about that, but flexible working arrangements are becoming more and more common. There was a bit of a shift to sort of increase time in the office, but it is sort of just worth noting that for some neurodivergent individuals, and even those that aren't, those flexible working arrangements can make quite a big difference, and be a bit of a game changer really, particularly as it provides a controlled environment free from sort of any sort of sensory triggers, I suppose. You know, that individual has control over that environment. And it also sort of allows that accommodation for different energy levels throughout the day, which we see often for neurodivergent individuals. It's also worth thinking about the different tools that can help with focus and organisation. So things like noise cancelling headphones, different sort of ergonomic equipment. So, for example, someone that has sort of lots of energy might benefit from having a standing desk, for example, that they're able to sort of like stand, walk around, and sort of just really make the most of that. Often these things don't need to be very expensive. It could be things like blue light filters for your screens even. So it's really worth just trying to find out what it is that someone might find a little bit more challenging at work, and if there's just very simple solutions that might make quite a quick fix for that person. Suggestions for support can also come out of things like workplace needs assessments, and we can perhaps talk about that a little bit later on, where, you know, a trained person can perform an assessment with the individual that might have some challenges within the workplace, and also plenty of strengths, but really identifying those places where improvements could be made, and often being able to provide that support when it's recommended as well. As I said, might be the case that these adjustments benefit lots of different people, not just those that are neurodivergent. Quiet space, clear communication, flexible working hours are all things that can really enhance the well-being and productivity of your entire team, regardless of whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent. So worth thinking about.
That's such a good point. I'm glad you came to that, because I was going to say the same thing. A lot of what you're talking about really applies to neurotypical people as well, in that everybody probably has their own preferences in terms of how they would like to operate. While if somebody's neurodivergent, it's more of a critical need maybe and more impactful to them than someone who's neurotypical. But it's worth then drawing on that theme I said we were probably going to return to a lot at the beginning of the call, which is, if ever in doubt, the best thing to do is to have a conversation with an individual. And this is something that we encourage all managers or team leads to do, is you'd always hopefully want to know what is critical or essential or helpful in order to support your employees or your team members to be as productive and constructive as possible. And so hopefully you'd always want to have a conversation about that, whether they identify as being neurodivergent or not. And then the other theme I would say is that, as you mentioned, these adjustments or these techniques or these approaches or these accommodations don't necessarily have to be expensive. Of course, there can be other things where money can be spent to help and assist, but when you're just starting, the first step is probably to just to have the conversation and invite somebody to offer some suggestions or some ideas of what would be more conducive to their productivity. And then, if you don't mind, I also wanted to emphasize in particular a couple of the things and just draw out a couple of the things that you mentioned, because late last year, we also had a webinar that was hosted by Celine, who's our Director of People and Operations, and she had on as her guest, or as who joined her, it was actually Jess Meredith. She's the CEO of Differing Minds. It's an organization that we're really proud to have partnered with, obviously for that webinar, but in general, in supporting and advocating for neurodiverse workplaces. And she really summarized this point, I thought, really well, which is if you think about how we work today and you think about ways of working and where we spend our time, she thought there were really two areas of focus that would probably cover off so much of people's needs. And they were in regards to meetings and then communicating. And on the first point, meetings, just as you said, some people will prefer, especially when we're doing a lot of virtual meetings, to do that with a lot of asynchronous communications, agendas up front, objectives for the meetings, as opposed to, can we all just jump on a call? Some people will do much better to follow up after they've read the transcript, the summary, the follow-up notes. Other people will probably want to be able to be unmuted and to contribute in real time as they go and as things occur to them. But other people might want to stay off mute or to stay muted and to be able to think about that in a more sort of sequential way, as opposed to somebody else. And so how people want to participate in meetings, do they want to raise hands? Do they want to just come off mute? Do they want to do, visual cues or signals? And just figuring out or discussing with people what their preferences are for meetings will go a long way because of how much time we spend in these. And then relating to that is just communication style. Do people prefer face-to-face one-to-ones, video call one-to-ones, video off and just verbal one-to-ones, asynchronous communications, maybe sending weekly updates as opposed to a conversation? How do they prefer to communicate with their sort of colleagues or other team members, and of course the manager, in order to just be able to get as much information out of the working relationship as possible? I thought those were really good points, that meetings and communication style generally will cover off so much of what we do. And again, none of that is expensive or necessarily costs any outlay, right, from the beginning. So thanks for taking us through that. Again, given that so many of you responded that you already have some adjustments in place or some accommodations in place, let us know if you'd prefer that we emphasize other points as well or highlight anything else. But I think, Holly, you've done a great job of being so comprehensive about all the different things that an organization can do. And I think, therefore, switching from tactics and actual things that can be sort of accommodated or adjusted for, I think it's worth taking a step back then and thinking about the culture within an organization and how then workplaces can foster a culture that's going to really celebrate. And again, we had on the previous slide, enhance or amplify or really bring out those superhero strengths, as I mentioned, or those strengths that you talked about with the traits for individuals that identify as neurodiverse.
Yeah, so I think with any sort of workplace culture, I do think change does start at the top. So it's really important that sort of leaders are vocal advocates for neurodiversity, and it sends a really powerful message, that this is like a core company value. And I think it's an essential step in creating that sort of truly inclusive, non-judgmental judgmental culture. It's worth considering whether you've got any other sort of policies in your workplace and sort of like looking at how well received and utilized those are. And it's sort of worth sort of mimicking the communication that's happened as implementing part of those policies. I think, providing neurodiversity training for managers as well is also really important. Sometimes it might be that those managers they are neurodivergent themselves and are sort of managing themselves as well as managing other people. So it's making sure that they have the resources to sort of appropriately sort of like look after their team and sort of support with those needs as well. We often find that those individuals that feel confident and are able to sort of communicate, they're sort of acting as the barrier, not the barrier, the sort of the link between that individual and also sort of like the support that comes with that. So it's important that they feel able to communicate that on behalf of those employees. Company-wide education initiatives as well can often help build that understanding, and it's a really great way to sort of normalize the conversations about neurodiversity and ensure that those employees feel included and respected. Then it's worth looking at sort of like those practical adjustments and flexible policies. Like, do you have a flexible working policy? Can you offer hybrid working? Can you have designated quiet spaces? Maybe people that hot desk, consider giving them a permanent workstation to reduce that sort of stress of constant change, not kind of knowing where you're going to be working each day. Again, quite a simple change. We talked already about how flexible hours can be a game changer and how that sort of environment can be sort of essential for their focus. And also thinking about leveraging sort of external support as well. In the UK, a valuable resource is Access to Work, which is a government programme, and it can be that provides funding for equipment, software, or other costs to support employees with disabilities, including neurodivergence. So this is like a workplace it's going to help workplaces accommodate employees without sort of shouldering the full financial burden. Then you have sort of thinking about that community, thinking about employee resource groups. So it gives employees a space to connect and sort of share experiences and sort of feel a sense of belonging, and also maybe talk about what it is that's helped them through the workplace as well. Things like champions, again, for any policy that you have within the workplace, is also a really fantastic resource to have. It's a dedicated person, whether that's someone in HR or it's just someone with lived experience. It can be really important in helping support neurodivergent individuals in this instance, but it provides a clear point of contact, and it ensures there is someone that has sort of read this policy inside and out, knows exactly where that support is, and sort of they have that specialized knowledge available to them.
Thank you for those. And I realized that we went straight into these and didn't really establish sort of why this is so important, and why within a company culture, even if people don't feel like it's maybe necessary to incorporate in their workplace culture today, how many people are probably affected by neurodiversity, and that we really haven't been able to clock or has been underreported to date. So before sort of summarizing or highlighting some of the points that you mentioned, I thought it was worth just revisiting or reminding folks what we're talking about, or the extent of it. And I know that, different reports, whether it's the Donaldson Trust, or I know that there have been other parties that also report between 1 in 7 or up to 1 in 5 people are neurodiverse or would identify themselves as being neurodivergent. That's clearly a pretty big pocket of a community, or whether it's a workplace or otherwise. And so if, up to 20% of a workplace is feeling neurodivergent, and that they might need accommodation or adjustments in order to communicate or to be productive at their work better, it's clearly something that I think most organizations would want to cover. We know that up to 45%, of individuals have lost or choose to leave their job because of challenges due to being misunderstood because of neurodiversity. And we know that neurodivergent individuals will say that with the proper support and with the communication that they can have with an inclusive culture, which is what you've been touching on now, that those individuals and those employees can feel up to 30% more productive. And that's a stat from Deloitte. So this really is important to incorporate in a culture. And I know that when we talk about wider health, and certainly we spend a lot of time talking about reproductive health, we talk about how it's really important to make sure that policies and cultures are truly inclusive. But this really applies to neurodivergence as well, in that, like you said at the top of the webinar, everybody's brain is different. Ways of working, how people process and how people think are really different. And so in order to really incorporate an inclusive culture, I'll just recap the points you made, which I loved, which is, first of all, it starts at the top. We need to make sure that leadership is truly engaged with this as a topic, probably already recognizes, whether it's subconscious or not, but hopefully bringing them to the table to talk about in a very conscious way, that even amongst the leadership table, whether it's the senior leadership team, whether it's the exec committee, whether it's the board, whether it's all of the directors, or whatever the case may be, is each of those people have different ways of processing information, and obviously collaborating in group conversations or in group output. And so recognizing that as applied to the entire company, that actually just magnifies is really important. You talked about then building up sort of internal expertise, is a way to put it. So whether that's through champions, whether that's through training. And I think one point we'd like to emphasize is that it isn't just, like you said, one size fits all. It's also not a one-time training hit, as in, oh, we're going to do a webinar, or we're going to produce, a handbook for people to talk about this topic, and then that's it. It has to be ongoing. The absolute definition of diversity, full stop, whether it's neurodiversity or otherwise, is that it's constantly changing, and that it's really, really broad and incorporates a lot of different perspectives. And so it's really important that training is ongoing, and that you grow with organizations, but with people that are affected most. And then the other thing which might be convenient for me to highlight, but you mentioned, well-being support and ensuring that there is actually support for individuals. I will take the chance then to use this slide, which is to highlight, for example, how we provide that support from Fertifa for our clients today. So at Fertifa, working with these specialist providers, their logos are on the bottom. And again, these are the relationships that Holly has diligenced and manages and ensures a certain level of quality that we would stand by. We can offer specialist navigation referrals to these partners, but also even in advance of that, pre-referral, we provide the well-being support for individuals who might think that they suffer from or have something that would make them neurodivergent, but not yet sure. They're not yet sure how to talk to their manager. Maybe they don't know how to maybe approach this with team members, with those colleagues of theirs, or even back at home with family members. And so the well-being support, the navigational advice, and everything that we provide historically for reproductive health is exactly what we would do for neurodiversity as well, in addition to the education awareness materials that we have. And there's a screenshot of what's available in our hub that's in our app for supporting neurodiversity. I didn't know if there's more you'd want to say about what your team does, or how you support individuals today, and how that can reflect a workplace's culture if they're working with, and it doesn't have to be for TIFA, right? But even somebody else in the sector that does similar work to what we do.
Yeah, so I think you've kind of covered most of it quite well. We, as a clinical service, we're there, we're available to be messaged, and it's always a human, it's never a bot or anything like that that you speak to. So we can be very flexible with timings. Like, we know that sometimes attending appointments on time can be quite challenging, and we're always happy to sort of like work with individuals on that to kind of like really kind of we try our absolute best to really understand some of the different challenges someone might be experiencing and applying that to them being able to access that support as well. We're not just talking about people that, or talking to people that are sort of simply curious and sort of wanting a diagnosis. Some people don't want to go down the diagnosis route at all and just sort of want to sort of put things in place that might help them, and we can kind of talk them through that. And it's not, again, not also just about sort of like the clinical side of things. It's sort of thinking about therapy or counselling that comes alongside that, with sort of some of the more emotional struggles that someone might have, and also sort of like the sort of financial burden of that too. Private assessments can be very, very expensive, so we'll talk to them about how they might be able to access that through the NHS as well. We sort of don't sort of just use partners, we kind of really talk to all the different options available to them, and sort of like the timelines for that as well. Obviously, it can be a little bit quicker going through the private sector than it is the NHS at the moment, but still some people do prefer to wait and sort of make the most of that service that's available to them. I think I've covered everything.
Yeah, you have, and that's perfect. You especially filled in blanks or gaps in things I said. Thank you for reminding everybody that obviously we would support individuals if they're already getting support or going through something with the NHS. It isn't just that we refer to private practice. And so we are here from a well-being standpoint for everybody, no matter where they are in their journey or where they might have questions. And speaking of questions, I'm mindful of the time, and as Holly knows, and my Fertifa colleagues know, or others who have been on webinars that I've hosted before, I usually like to give people a bit of time before the next hour, because we are in a world of back-to-back calls. But I do think we have maybe 5 to 10 minutes to take some of these questions that have come into the chat that we've seen just for us as hosts and panelists. So I appreciate everyone who has provided input, been answering questions regarding the slides, regarding the follow-ups, and then there's some other questions, if you don't mind, Holly, that we might just go through, okay? So one just came in while you were just talking about some of the points, for example, with respect to what people might appreciate support on. And somebody asked, for example, what would you do if you are managing someone, or there's someone on your team who you think might be neurodiverse, but they've not mentioned it, they've not raised it. And like you said, some people might not want to go through a screening or a diagnosis, or, don't think they necessarily need extra support, or they're coping just fine. But do you have advice for a manager that might think that there's something that could be provided to an employee, but they've not raised it yet?
That's a really good question. I think, as with it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think if someone has not talked to you about their neurodivergent status, or that they haven't sort of disclosed anything like that to you, and you maybe have some sort of concerns, I think it's worth looking at sort of the traits. So if you're seeing that someone has got a fantastic attention to detail, but is maybe then sort of not focusing on some of the other responsibilities, it's sort of talk to them about that. I can see that this has happened. Can we talk about what it is that we can do to support you with that, to make sure that doesn't happen again? And, you know, sort of going through that route instead. You know, you're fantastic at this, but I have noticed this. And I think that's kind of quite a good balance of doing that. Obviously there is sort of other support that you can sort of think about. So, you know, if that individual says that perhaps being able to focus on one task at a time is their best way of doing that, is there anything that the company can do to support with that? It might be that someone wants to consider a workplace needs assessment, and again, you can go ahead with these without having a diagnosis beforehand, where, as I talked about it already, that individual can meet with somebody who is a specialist in that area. They can talk through the things that they find great and maybe not so great in their workplace, and then suggest sort of support or software, or, you know, different devices that might be able to support with that as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And sorry, I was responding to someone else in the chat, so I'm sorry if I forgot to mute when I was doing that and you could hear me pounding furiously or typing furiously. Apologies while you were talking. Another question that's come in, which is similar, but maybe not exactly the same, which is, what would you advise to an individual, so it's an employee, it's a patient who's booked in, who thinks they are neurodiverse, potentially thinking they might have ADHD or autism, but they don't have a formal diagnosis?
So if someone thinks they might have something like ADHD and they don't have a diagnosis but are wanting a diagnosis, there's a number of different options that they can go down. The first is the NHS. The waiting time can be quite lengthy. It can be upwards of sort of like a year, 2 years sometimes for adults at the moment. It's longer, I think, if you're a child, or if you have a child that is perhaps going through a similar route. There are lots and lots of different private services that do offer ADHD and autism assessments, or sort of depending on what it is that you're looking for a diagnosis in. Obviously, we've listed a couple that we partner with. So if you do have access to Vitiva through your workplace, and it is always worth booking in a discovery call, speaking with one of our advisors, and we can talk through the different options available to you. Depending on the assessment that someone is seeking, it might be that it's recommended that that assessment happens in person, face to face, as there are often several aspects of that assessment that need to be done with someone there with you, rather than it being sort of virtual. So it's always worth sort of like having a look at what services are available locally to you, rather than sort of some of these big companies that sort of are nationwide but only offer virtual. And I think as well, it's sort of, again, looking at what works best for you. If you're someone that does struggle sort of with virtual meetings, and, you know, likes to sit with someone and sort of pick up on verbal, you know, body language a bit easy in a different way, then you might find that that sort of an in-person assessment is what's working better for you. I talked about access to work as well. So that's a government scheme, and that can support with sometimes support with some of the sort of financial aspects of that as well. But there's also criteria whether you can meet that as well. So worth having a little look just in case any of that is covered. Hopefully that's answered that question.
Yeah, I think that's really comprehensive. Thank you very much. And in answering that question, you mentioned briefly NHS and NHS wait lists. Somebody has also mentioned in the Q&A box, and probably because I picked up on it but didn't really go into it when we were talking earlier about the NHS support in addition to private clinicians or practitioners. They have asked and acknowledged the NHS waitlist is quite long, but they wanted to know how Fertifa might be able to support with diagnosis, for example, because if somebody were to go private, it might be that that's not covered for them. Obviously, they'd have to pay out of pocket, and not only for the diagnosis, but potentially for medication as well. And they were wondering if Fertifa can do anything to support with either, I think, if I infer the question right, the NHS waitlist, or actually the costs at private treatment as well.
Yeah, so it depends on sort of where you are in that process. So if you want to sort of wait in that NHS queue and not sort of move to the private sector, then obviously we can support with just sort of like the emotional well-being. If you just want to sort of second opinion something with our team, you can message, you can book in discovery calls, you can speak to somebody if you'd like to. We have external resources that we can also signpost you to as well. So if we can't help you in-house, we'll have a network of clinical partners that would be able to sort of step in where we're not able to. So if you do need sort of something like, for example, more routine counselling, we can signpost you to a partner that is able to support with that. Same with if you are perhaps struggling with something else. So it might be that you are seeking a diagnosis for ADHD, but there's actually something else that is sort of like, you know, health is not everything in silos. There's lots of different things that overlap with each other. We know that women who there's an increased instance of women suffering with PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is like a very, very, very severe case of PMS, for example. We know that those women have a higher instance of having ADHD. So it's like, you know, there's lots of things that overlap, so we can support you along other pathways as well. If it is that you want to move away from the NHS waiting list and kind of move quicker and kind of move for an assessment with the private sector, then obviously what we would do is arrange a discovery call with you, talk about what it is that you're seeking, and then if necessary, we can then refer you to our clinical partners who would then be able to carry out the assessment as part of their service. We're there in the background, providing support, checking in, making sure everything's okay, that it is what you're looking for, that you're kind of getting on well with the service provider that you have, and just sort of checking that that process is going as smoothly as possible. The same with medication as well. Lots of our clinical partners are able to provide medication, and if they're not able to, then they're able to signpost to someone that is then able to support you with that. We often find that if anyone is prescribed medication, that it can sometimes be that they go back to the NHS or their GP and ask for that medication to be continued on the NHS as well. So we'll talk about all those different options available to them.
Amazing, thank you. And then I did answer in the Q&A, but somebody also asked, because I think you did such a convincing job about how Fertifa can assist people, about whether or not Fertifa was available to individuals at the moment or only through workplaces. So I have clarified or responded that it's available only to workplaces. However, we're really happy to speak to any HR teams if that's useful to anybody, or to try and help advocate for Fertifa within a workplace, of course, which I think is a good segue for me to go into this slide in case there's anybody that would like to learn more about Fertifa potentially for their workplace. This isn't meant to be an advert, but just as a resource. So you can email us at enquiries@fertifa.com or use this QR code to book in a call. I'll leave this up while I also launch the last poll question that we have, and that I think would be a useful way to sort of wrap things up. I've already warned that I want to give people a little bit of time left. So whilst people might be thinking about moving on or prepping for their next meeting, here's a poll just to get a gauge for whether or not this was useful or not. The questions are whether or not the webinar has made anybody on the call any more interested in enhancing the current workplace neurodiversity support. And the second one is whether or not they might consider doing that then with a benefits provider, whether that's Fertifa or somebody else within the sector. And taking a cue from the earlier comment, which I do appreciate, and not to overstimulate, I will just stop talking now whilst giving people a chance to respond to this poll. So I'll give people another 5 to 10 seconds. My point of neurodiversity might be that I'm not good at leaning into the silence, especially on a webinar call. So I'm sorry if this is distracting people who are still responding, but we have had the poll open for almost a minute and a half. So I'm going to end the poll and then share the results with people if that's all right. So we have seen that actually 95% of you who responded did say this made you more interested in potentially offering or enhancing workplace neurodiversity support. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you to Holly for all of the comprehensive answers, which clearly led to that. And then also that almost half, so 46% would consider working with a neurodiversity benefits provider, with a fantastic more than 15%, so 17% saying they already do, which is absolutely brilliant to see. And also somebody else asked a question in the Q&A while we were waiting for those poll answers about whether or not the session is being recorded. So yes, if you missed the top of the webinar, the opening and the welcome and housekeeping, this has been recorded. We will send out the link to the recording to everybody who had registered in advance. And if you do want any other information, resources, for instance, somebody else had asked for slides as well, just respond to that email and we'll be happy to help however we can. I didn't know if Holly had anything that she'd want to say or highlight to cut through my rambling, with sort of last thoughts to impart people with, or if there was sort of one key takeaway you wanted to highlight. But I really, really wanted to thank you for all of the insights that you brought to this, and obviously as a reflection of what your entire clinical team does in support of individuals who book and speak to you. Don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
I think the two main things for me is that just remembering that neurodivergence is a difference and not a deficit, and it's not a one size fits all approach, and always be led by the individual that you're speaking to as to sort of what's going to work best for them, and don't just make assumptions, really.
That's
So yeah,
perfect.
glad to have been here today.
Oh, no, it's brilliant to have you. And that's perfect. I mean, I love, like you said, the way you presented the other slide, which is not only is it potentially not deficiencies, but they're strengths, they're superpowers. So I really appreciate the perspective and how everything that hopefully we've talked about today is about enhancing or amplifying what people bring to their work, and ensuring that as individuals, as team members, as colleagues, as managers, or as HR professionals, we're doing the best that we can to get maximum contribution from everybody within an organization, whether they identify as neurodivergent or otherwise, just because we are all different. And that what we do here at Fertifa is to try and help organizations be as inclusive as possible. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. But again, a really, really heartfelt thank you to Holly for being put on the spot for all of those questions, all of my ramblings, and helping us to make it so concise and succinct. I really appreciate everyone joining today. Hopefully you'll get in touch if there's anything else we can do to support your organizations. But otherwise, thank you again for joining us today, and hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much, Holly.
Thank you. Thanks, Eileen.